changing the world of work for women everywhere. We are Watermark. We're the only nonprofit women's leadership organization that spans all industries. We connect, develop, and advocate for the advancement of women in the workplace. The Watermark community includes senior executives, entrepreneurs, and emerging executives that support you not only at the top of your field, but also on your way up.
Well, thank you, and we got a great crowd here. We have a great panel for you. I've been in the business of business journalism for an awfully long time. In fact, it was 32 years ago that a guy by the name of Gifford Pinchot wrote a book. It was called Intrapreneurship. The subtitle of it is Why You Don't Have to Leave the Corporation to Become an Entrepreneur. And so here we are 32 years later. I'd like to think that a lot of what Gifford and other people have done in those 32 years have been to make larger organizations more nimble and flexible. I happen to be a little more skeptical about that, however, because I know how bureaucratic organizations quickly become and how difficult it is to advance ideas and innovation in large organizations. So today we have a group of people who are doing it, who can speak to it, and I hope to learn as much as you will from them. So let's bring everyone onto the stage here, and I'll introduce each of them to you. You know, the full bio for each person actually is up on the screen, but it's also in your program. I'm not going to waste too much time with those bios, but rather introduce you to everyone by name and just by title. So immediately to the left of me, we have our GE guy.
Thank you.
He's been at GE for 21 years, Mike Kareem, Chief Financial Officer of ServiceMax, and he works out here in the Valley. And then next to him, we have Renee Nemi, who's a Vice President and General Manager of Smart Home at Logitech. And then we have, next to her, Giselle Diocampo Gudem, the co-founder of PwC's Global Financial Services Innovation Center. And then finally, but of course not least, we have Rena Ramin, Vice President of Programmable Solutions Group and General Manager of the Customer Experience Group at Intel, a company she joined recently. She had been at Samsung before that. Welcome, everybody. So let's start with just a definition of what is intrapreneurship. Renee, you want to take that?
Sure. The simplest definition is the ability to start a new idea, product within the context of a larger company. The most successful situations I've seen is when you actually have the fully independent teams and you free the startup within the larger company of having to constantly worry about the funding and going out to do the funding. But we tend to think of it primarily as product-oriented and being kind of a product girl. That would be my tendency, but it really can be anything. It can be starting a new channel. It can be starting a new way you serve your customer from a customer service point of view. It doesn't have to be specifically products, but essentially it's the ability to start a company without having to worry about funding under the umbrella of a larger organization.
And Giselle, you have a similar definition?
I would say yes, and I think what I would add to that is also for intrapreneurs and to think about them as people with an entrepreneurial spirit, with the speed and agility and the energy around building new things and creating new products and services. with a kind of special twist to it, meaning that you have some resident knowledge of an industry or the firm so that you can harness the assets of your firm and company to make innovation work from within.
And how do you get started? I mean, Reno, how would you get started? How have you gotten started?
Well, if I look at my experience, both Intel and previously Samsung, right? There's been different models. So if I take the Samsung model, I was part of the Samsung Strategy and Innovation Center, and the model there was lots of little groups that worked on new innovative projects, on new exciting things that they were trying to bring to the market. Some of those ideas may or may not come to fruition. But if any particular project got to a point where there was enough market interest, then a larger team was built around that. And then if that team was able to get the revenues up to a certain threshold, then they would get either spun into Samsung as a new division or get spun out of Samsung as a separate company. And there was an ecosystem also that went with it in the form of funding in terms of Samsung Ventures or the capital, Samsung Ventures that would fund, or the Catalyst Fund that would fund them. And I see a sort of a similar approach at Intel in terms of funding the ecosystem, in that, Intel has Intel Capital, which they use to find companies that would fit the ecosystem in areas that we're growing in and innovating in, and the next leap forward, and making sure that those systems are in place through that funding.
Mike, is there a GE approach to internal innovation?
Yeah, we've had a long history of internal innovation. We have huge R&D centers across the globe where we actually do that. But I think a lot of what we've thought about from a GE perspective is, we're a 125-year-old company, and for us, entrepreneurship was more about kind of contemporizing or modernizing our company. And so we decided to come out here to the Valley, where a lot of those agile practices and contemporary type of thinking was. And so we started out here on that journey, if you will, and I was employee number 3. I originally came out, as I would say, to watch the money, or that's what I thought I was going to do. And we started down this journey of what we would almost call our own internal kind of transformation. And so we thought about that as really thinking about leveraging the capabilities of software and the talent to be able to do that, because that's how we actually see the future is kind of moving. And so we set up a shop out in the East Bay, and rightly or wrongly started with hiring 1,000 people, which wasn't the smartest thing to do at first, but we got through it.
How many do you have now?
So right now we're around 1,500 people. We're around 25,000 people globally in what we call the larger GE Digital brand is what we use in terms of, and there we're just thinking about software and how that helps our customers.
Yeah. Well, Giselle, can anybody be an entrepreneur?
I would say the short answer is yes, and I think part of it is mental model. So if I'll just take a step back, I think you mentioned that GE's a 125-year-old company. PricewaterhouseCoopers is a 167-year-old company. We have been successful in many areas of the business, and success sometimes breeds conformity. And the idea about being an intrapreneur and thinking about how to extend your lines of business, and parts of it could be also how to continue your legacy of success. I think resident within organizations, you already have people that think about how to grow the business, how to extend to new markets, and how to work and collaborate in different ways. And it's certainly, I think, a skill set that you can continue to learn and develop.
But you still see a lot of companies that basically acknowledge that they can't do innovation inside the bigger parent. So what they do is they create little teams, and they protect the teams by sending them off someplace. The old word was skunk works from Lockheed, and IBM did this to develop their PC in Boca Raton, Florida. What system works better? Do you have to have a little team that's protected with certain resources that are assigned to it, that sort of goes off and doesn't have someone around to squash it? Or is it possible to have, in a large company, a culture that fosters this innovative attitude and actually encourages entrepreneurship among all its employees? Who wants to take that?
So I think it's absolutely possible, even in a large company, to foster that innovative spirit, right? Because you look at the ingredients of what makes an entrepreneur, right? It is the innovation, it's the risk-taking, it's the rewarding certain motivational behaviors that are associated with entrepreneurship. In an entrepreneurship model, you want all of those basically, but in a corporate environment, and you want to encourage those. And I find that absolutely true to be, to be true at Intel. And I can tell you from my own perspective, when I'm managing my team in the customer experience group, I want to urge and reward risk-taking to some degree that is going to get us to a better, leap forward.
Yeah, I think I would add, from a big company perspective, obviously, we thought about it, 300,000 employees, 9 or 10 operating divisions. The skunk work approach was kind of needed, because for certain this will get killed inside of a big company. There's tends to be some passive-aggressive behavior, always fighting for resources and all these things. So we specifically did it that way, where we carved it out. We dedicated the funding, and we said that funding should be there for 3 years and that nobody should touch it. And then the most important thing, I think, at the GE is it was really led from our chairman. And a lot of these things are best, a tops-down approach versus a bottoms-up approach. And he really gave us the ability to have a voice and gave us a constant seat at the table to kind of keep pushing and pushing for what we are doing, and more or less not to push, but to actually show what we are, capable of doing.
Right. And Renee, there's a certain breed of people that I imagine are naturally attracted to entrepreneurship, just as there is a certain breed of people who are more tolerant of risk, who would like to be entrepreneurs. What's the right mix when you're assembling a team, or you have an initiative that's inside the company of people to make stuff happen?
So when you look at the characters of a successful leader, it always starts with a good leader. Of course, there's a lot of commonality with an entrepreneur. They got to be creative. They've got to be self-starters. If I had to say that there were 3 kind of golden, very hard, it's kind of the unicorn of entrepreneurship, is really starts with passion. You really have to believe and have passion for what you're doing, because it's going to be hard work. And it's probably even going to be harder than if you were standalone, because you've got kind of all of the innovative startup pressures, but then you as the leader have to go back and continuously sell and keep the funding flowing. Okay, so passion. The second is. The second characteristic is really this ability to listen. And when I say listen, it's listen to your customers, it's listen to your your staff, and its ability to pivot. Anybody here been in a startup, you'll know that rarely does your first idea and how you envision that idea actually is right. It's rarely right. And the good leader has the ability to pivot, right? To listen, to grab that idea and pivot. And then I would say the third characteristic is multidimensional. A lot of folks say, oh, well, it's a product, it should be an engineer. It's like, no, it doesn't have to be. I've seen finance leaders, as much as they can be good bean counters, but I've seen them, because what happens is, for instance, I knew a particular finance leader who really got into the business, got into the product, and was actually listening when they were at the table, and had this multi-dimensional ability to put all the pieces together. Because when you make a decision, it's not about whether or not it's technically feasible, but it's about, is it technically feasible? Are we making the right market trade-offs? Can we actually produce it for the right amount of money, and what's the lead time to market, right? I mean, there's like no less than 10 dimensions to every decision. So those are the three: multidimensional, passionate, and were you listening?
I was listening. I buy it. I buy it. Rita, do you have a take on that?
I do. I think there are certain characteristics that do help people become more successful as an entrepreneur. Some of those skills can be learned, some of those might be inherent, and some of those might be more suited depending on where you are in your life, in the sense that if you are, I think being a self-starter is a key ingredient that you absolutely must be if you want to work in an environment where the path hasn't already been forged, and so you're trying to innovate. You have to be willing to try different things and be able to push those things. Second, you need to be a people's person in the sense that you have to be able to work with a wide variety of people, not just within that incubation environment that you're working in, but in an entrepreneurial setting, in the context of a larger corporation. You might need to work within certain confines of the larger corporation and make sure that you're still getting the funding from the larger corporation. And also from a timing perspective, you might find that you want that safety net of the larger corporation while you still are the type of person driven to take risks. You might want that safety net of that larger corporation based on where you are in your life, and you might have a family to support or whatever.
John, I wanted to add something around the support for entrepreneurs, and I wanted to share something that my team and I at PwC constantly think about in terms of our innovation philosophy, and that is how you innovate determines what you innovate. And part of the team of entrepreneurs that you will build and may build, you can try to help yourself. So for example, getting buy-in from executive leadership is one of the most critical factors to help you along the way with either sourcing, developing, and commercializing ideas. I think the second thing is also figuring out a way to collaborate with others. So meaning build relationships at all levels of the organization. Because some ideas can start from your leadership or your really brilliant finance guy, and some of them will start from other parts of your business. But the key to making an idea into an innovation, and not all innovation will become successes, is that you're able to move it through the organization and develop it and test it to make it into the viable businesses that the company and your team are hoping for. And then what I would also say is what's important is to have a defined innovation strategy that's closely linked to the corporate innovation strategy. And that is a really critical kind of thought and component, because you brought up skunkworks, John, and that I think irrespective of the type of model or where your teams are housed, what's really important is that the organization needs to know that what you guys are doing is important to the company. And so being linked to the innovation strategy and defining processes that support whether you want to have or create incremental innovation, which you'll have a different type of model for that, or breakthrough and radical innovation. But the bottom line is you've got to have an innovation strategy that's tied to your corporate strategy and a process that supports your innovation strategy.
And Mike, what accelerators has GE found to entrepreneurship?
Well, I think just to echo some of the comments you've already heard, you definitely need a champion, and you may find out that you may be that champion. And so that obviously requires courage. I would say, those are the big things that come to mind. Secondly, I would say, the real accelerator is I think people underappreciate how much selling inside the large corporations you have to do. As we were kind of talking about, you need friends. There's capabilities in the organization that are siloed that you need. And so a lot of it is almost selling your story to them but you're selling to them in a way that's actually exciting them, making them a part of this thing as well, of the kind of the journey that you're on, is another big thing. Because if you can't sell it, people just will continue to be pessimistic about what it is that you're trying to start. And I think lastly, it goes without saying, is a diversity of experiences and people that you have, and who you hire and who you look at. When you start these things in a vacuum, in a way, you're kind of prone to the thinking all the same, and so you need people that are obviously diverse and that can have open conversations. Because what I see a lot in large corporations is that people will just kind of what I call pocket veto. They won't necessarily overtly disagree. They'll be nice about it, but if you don't get to that candid kind of conversation, you really can't innovate and you really can't champion things ahead.
And a lot of that is true even in relatively small companies. I mean, in the early
Yeah.
days of Apple, Steve Jobs basically went off to develop the Macintosh, flew pirate flags, and made everyone think they were outlaws and rebels because he didn't want that effort squashed by the core product in the company that was actually making revenue and profit.
Agreed.
So that's still true. What do you think are the biggest barriers to entrepreneurship?
The biggest barriers are probably, part of what you were talking about earlier in terms of having to sell. And here's the thing. Those skills that you need are the same thing regardless of whether you're outside the company being an entrepreneur in a startup or you're being in a large company. When you're doing a startup, you're selling to the VCs who are providing your funding possibly, or your investors are providing your funding. In a larger corporation, you are selling to your coworkers, and hopefully it's going to be a little bit easier because you've built those relationships with them and you have that trust with them and they know. But at the same time, it could be a barrier because you are competing against the same funds that might potentially go into some other avenue. And, when I look at Intel, they have this approach where you can actually, certain times of the year, you can actually come in and pitch your story. And you could get funded. There's a program where you could get funded when you pitch your story to, sort of an internal Shark Tank, so you will, within Intel.
Well, what are the metrics for success here? Want to try that one, Renee?
This is a dangerous conversation, honestly.
We love danger.
I used to work for a company called Danger. True story. Different panel, not this one. It's not one size fits all, is the bottom line here. There is a danger for the metric to be revenue. And it's the most obvious, it's the easiest to fund. But I truly believe with all my heart it's risky. And the reason why I say that is because, as I mentioned before, you rarely get it right the first time. And if you don't get it right, guess what? Your revenue is not going to come. And so having a certain predetermined runway with multiple indicators of success, I really think is key. And having a belief and a passion for the truth. Now, there are a couple of other leading metrics that are really good in this scenario. One of them is customer engagement. So let's say your goal was to get, this is a random number, 100,000 users in 6 months. Let's say you only got 10,000 of them, but the 10,000 of them are on your service every single day for 3 hours. Or your other scenario is you got your 100,000, but they're on your service once every 2 weeks. Which would you rather have, and which could you actually grow? And so it's really important that you understand what you're trying to achieve. And again, this learning and agility point, I will just keep emphasizing, because if you've got the 10,000, I didn't get to the 100,000, then what was it about the engagement that caused them to engage, and how do we build on that? And keeping those metrics constantly in front. Another one other small point, I don't want to hog the mic, but time to learning is a really important measure. If you, and this really forces you to take more of an agile approach to the learning, which is really hard when you're in hardware, by the way, which Logitech is. But being able to get to prototypes, test the prototypes, grab the learning, and be able to iterate is really, really, really key to success. And so, so getting that time to learning ratio down from, like if you had to wait for a full build cycle, 12 months to get any learning, then that's going to be really painful for the company. But if you can get a learning in every 6 weeks, that is much easier to sell, if you will.
Giselle, at PwC, what are the metrics for success in intrapreneurship?
I wanted to underscore a point that you brought up, Renee, that it's no one size fits all. And just for context, about 3 years ago, we started this Global Financial Services Innovation Center, which is the first of its kind in PwC's history. And that's an important point that I wanted to bring up, because part of new businesses and trying to get away from old metrics like revenue, it's important, but I think it's a timing thing.
Who wants to make money?
Yeah, well, it's important to make money, but I think that the main point is that, one, when you're growing something new, you kind of have the privilege to actually make up your metrics. So learning metrics is an important. And I think the second piece of it is as you grow and mature. So as an example, when we were first starting out, we were very focused on some of the principles I talked about earlier, getting buy-in from leadership, ensuring that we were educating and transferring knowledge to others so that we can figure out ways to work together. So we would measure our success relative to how fast we were learning and who we were connecting with and the types of connections we were making. So as a quick example, if I connected with Rena and did we come up with an idea and where is it now in the development stage? As we matured as a business, we had ideas within our portfolio that we could then measure in terms of speed of prototype and how fast it was going through our funnel of the innovation process. Those required us to figure out different ways to measure our productivity as a team, the value that we're giving back to our organization, and then the actual progress of that idea that we were working on. So if you think about kind of those three levels, there's the operational piece and success, there's the value that we're creating, and then there's a portfolio of your ideas. Those are different types of metrics, and I think it's an important, and I agree with you, it is talking about metrics and performance, especially for new things, it is dangerous, but I think, think about it as there's a spectrum, 1, 2, you have the privilege to make it up, and it's based on data that you're learning from the prototyping. And 3, I think very importantly, communicate them to others. And if it's a new metric like learning, I mean, I'll tell you, on the fly, PwC, we're an audit, tax, we do advisory, but we're a whole bunch of quant folks. So when I introduce things like our rate of learning is this, I mean, we had some blank faces. So no surprise. Yeah. So part of what we learned as a team is we have a mental model. The people that we work with have a range of mental models, but we have a shared goal, driving new value, creating new markets, getting that dollar sign, right? So how do we as entrepreneurs help educate people so that we can communicate with a shared language around success?
Yeah. And just to echo, because my title says I'm the metrics finance guy, I agree. You throw out those traditional measurements, and you don't use those. I would say, we're at GE, we're constantly measuring the people. What people do we have? Do we have the right skill set? Are they really engaged? Do we need even bigger people to do what we need to do? I think we're looking, as you guys were talking about, how quickly do we fail? In big companies, failing is not what people do. I've never been to a review where someone comes in with a PowerPoint page and has all red stoplights and says, we should kill this. Like, it never happens, but maybe it should. And I think lastly, what we're really trying to measure is really, you got to get to an outcome. And those outcomes will continuously change, right? So maybe when you're starting, it's how many people have you trained? How many people are using your internal product, right? Or how many customers eventually do you have using this? So, think about it as something that's flexible and it is always evolving, but, there's always a fierce competition for money and for resources, and so you have to be able to show progress, and that's the most important metric you can have.
Okay, we're going to talk about progress in a minute, but I want everyone to know I'm going to have a quiz before we're all over here. There are 2 panelists here who have MBAs and 2 who are engineers. So I'm going to have the audience guess which ones you are at the end of this presentation. I think people are going to be really confused and surprised by the outcome. All right, let's talk a little bit about success. Let's share a success story and make it good, because the second question is, give me a failure and what you've learned from it. Rena?
So I think Intel has a great success story in the making as well. Especially since we're here at the Watermark conference, I think this is especially important to talk about. In terms of innovation, I strongly feel that innovation's not just about innovating your products. I think a couple of the panelists touched on this earlier. It could be innovating your business processes. It could be innovating on your people and your workforce. And Intel is very committed to getting parity by 2020. And we've been working towards that in terms of our success metrics. We're working towards 45% hire rate on diverse hiring. And I think that's a great success story. We're well on our way to those goals, as our CEO, Brian Krzanich, talks about it at every opportunity that he gets publicly as well, and talks about where we are. And so I think that's a great success story.
Give me one from Samsung, because you were at Samsung before Intel and spent a good deal of time there, right?
Yeah, good deal. I spent less than 2 years there, but I have worked in the Bay Area for almost 29 years, but at Samsung for a couple of years. And so from a Samsung perspective, one of our success stories was we spun out a company, and since I left, I don't know if it's public yet, so I can't say, but we did spin out a company that came out of the SSIC. It reached our revenue goals and was spun out. And just, if you've seen the big new Samsung building at North First and Tasman, it's just 3 doors down from there, so it's spun out and moved 3 doors away, but in the sort of memory space.
Mike, tell us a story of success at GE.
As we kind of started this journey, we started out, as I was talking about, with 2 to 3 people, and then we grew it to what it is now, about 1,500 people. I think one of the milestone moments was one of our divisions had a whole bunch of problems and had about a $400 to $500 million headwind challenge. And we were at the time really trying to grow our data science kind of capabilities in terms of how we thought about data and what could that mean for machines, and really kind of learning. And we got a call from the chairman, and we went down to this business unit with 5 data scientists, a bunch of software engineers, and they basically told us, hey, we don't want you here. Please go away. You don't understand our domain. You're not in this industry. We've had people here for 30 years that know how to do it. And you have some guy from Silicon Valley that is 19 and probably could grow up a little bit. And we went back and forth, and we fought with them. And at the end of the day, we got the right people involved. And I think we did the right things with the data, and we started unlocking things that they never thought about. And really simplifying things with contemporary technology, which was kind of the big thing that they didn't have. And so we got to this kind of moment where that realization of saving $400 to $500 million was really a success. And that really bolstered kind of what we were talking about here in terms of entrepreneurship, is that you have to go sell that to all the other businesses, because in our world of large corporates, until you sell the value of what you can bring, people will always continue to think that that's some skunk work, or people are just throwing away money on that, and they don't really get any value out of it.
Renee, do you have a success story?
Yeah. We're actually in the middle of a success story now at Logitech. So about 5 years ago, Bracken Darrell, who's our CEO, came on board, and one of the interesting twists he really put on, he really believes in innovation at the core, and he created a new model for the company. It's called Trees, Plants, and Seeds. And anybody can actually propose a seed. It's a very simple one-pager process, and you put the one-pager process through the system. And if the team says, hey, that's a good idea, you get funded, and you get like seed funding, and then you get more funding, and then you go Series A, Series B. Like it's a great model. And one of the programs that was funded out of that was actually a smart home program. It's now a product category in the IP camera space. It's called the Circle. And what was really interesting is we took an entrepreneur who we brought in from the outside. He said, I've got this great idea. And it started as a wearable camera, honestly, one that you actually put on your body. And it was more of a social connection concept. And without going into a lot of details, that was actually a failure. But remember I mentioned that you need to listen and you need to pivot, right? And so they were listening to the market, listening to the customer, and they took that same technology and they put that concept, but more in a fixed camera with battery. Fast forward, they took it to market, great reviews for the people who bought it, but a lot of people didn't buy it. And you go, well, why didn't they buy it? Well, because it was marketed as a social camera, not a security camera. Again, listened to the market, and ended up pivoting one more time to security, and then all of a sudden, we're one of the top 3 security cameras in kind of the smart home market. So a really great example where you take this idea, and by the way, we had the technology, so we had all the core concepts. Took what was good about Logitech, the security and optic technology, an amazing ops team that can get things to market quickly, and then an amazing sales team and sales channel, and we were able to take this idea and pivot and learn. So that was our success story.
And the time frame from idea to product launch, and then the reiteration of marketing it as a security product?
It's about 6 months. It was pretty clear after 6 months in the market that we had to pivot. Actually, it's probably clearer 3 months. Took us a bit to pivot, but yeah.
Okay, Giselle, you have a success story at PwC?
Yes, and since you're going to be asking about failures and how
getting
much,
ready.
yeah, we love the F word. No, we don't. We really do. We really, really do not like the F word. So I will share a story around that and what my team learned from it. We are all good at various different things. So our senior leadership team, we know, is really great at navigating and leading our existing business. What my team and I are really great at is building new businesses. Our failure as a team, and my failure as a leader of that team, is to recognize this earlier. So as we were expanding our operations, we had some hypotheses, and in particular, we had hypotheses around growing the Asia Pacific market. We as a firm have certain skill sets there, and we were partnering with various very kind of strong partnerships locally. And so we had hypotheses and assumptions on our rate of growth. Along the way, we got advice from our senior leaders that they knew the markets that were a sure bet. And so at that time, I was thinking, okay, perhaps they know a lot more about the marketplace and know a lot more about the firm, and we can move things and make things happen more quickly. Well, that was not the case. When we weren't growing and progressing as we should have been, I really had to kind of take a step back, and the team take a step back and go back to what I was mentioning about earlier, our innovation strategy, and figure out what we needed to focus on. And it was an aha moment for all of us, because at that time, I can confidently figure out what we as a team can say no to. So it was like a permission to say no. And again, our failure was not to recognize this earlier. And when we did, we were able to pivot, take our resources, both financially and our people, to figure out, one, experiment based on the hypotheses of the marketplaces that we were seeing. Two, gather the data for what we were succeeding in, what was moving slowly, and what we should double down on investment-wise, and what we should kill. And that process ended up to be something that saved us, got us to progress much more quickly, and now our Asia-Pacific region is the highest innovation activity from China on down to Australia. So it is a huge success for us, and not without the challenge of figuring out how to pivot and when to pivot, and how to teach and learn from one another about, with our senior leadership, about how to work together to share those knowledge and figure out how to replicate that.
Great. Okay, I want to give the audience a little time for Q&A. If anyone has a question, we're happy and eager to answer one. I see one way, I see actually a few back there.
We have a question back here.
Super.
I have a question for you about, you talked about the importance of communicating with other divisions internally and building trust across those divisions. When you have a success, how do you recognize the success? Is it the Innovation Center was successful? Is it all of the people who were involved? How do you recognize the success and continue to motivate people to work with this innovation group?
That's a great question. You absolutely need to recognize everybody that contributed to that success, not just the Innovation Center. You might have actually partnered in some form of technology that was used in the product that came from a different group. That's especially true when you're working in a larger company. There are so many different technologies that already exist, so much IP. I look at Intel, the number of patents and IP that exists within Intel is just amazing. So if I can use some portion of that IP to further my product, which is in a completely different space, I need to go back and recognize that team that contributed to that success as well.
By the way, I want to add, because success is one thing, but actual successful entrepreneur programs actually celebrate the creators as well. And you know, I have to say Logitech does that extremely well. It will actually give the team a bonus. We'll have them come up and congratulate them at our weekly huddles. And you know, we give them quite a bit of visibility because learning and learning quickly is success too.
Hi, my name is Diana. This question is for Joselle. Just to back up, Renee talked about some of the metrics of innovation, specifically being multidimensional and passionate. So for Joselle, for you to co-found an innovation center within PwC, which is over 100 years old, there must have been people before you who tried to start an innovation center. How were you able to sell to get the buy-in from leadership to start such an innovation center when those before you have failed, and create metrics that is not the old metric like you mentioned, revenue-based, but in actuality based on passion and based on multi-dimension?
Thank you. I heard a couple of questions within your question, and I'll just play it back to you. So the first one is kind of how did we get started and kind of connect in with leadership, and then the second one is kind of around the metrics piece. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So just I guess a quick story around the leadership piece. One way to get leaders bought in is to work with your clients and customers to get data from them to support the case for change. And that was something that our team and our leadership team knew that was happening in the marketplace. We helped to further educate them around, so for example, we're focusing on financial services and the disruption and changes, and figuring out a way to communicate to them what is important and why now. So those are important elements, and again, like work with others to help you with that case, because it is important to get your executive leadership buy-in. And for the metrics piece, I think that kind of the best way that I can kind of give you some mental models around it is that as you're starting something new, you have to have the flexibility to figure out how to measure the progress of your team. And to what I was mentioning earlier, progress for your team may be a little bit different, and it will depend on the goals of your innovation center. So for example, our goal was to establish an innovation center where we can find, source, develop innovations. That was the end goal. But in the very first part of establishing that is we needed to get a team in place. We needed to get funding in place. And so there were these elements that we had to progress towards as we were also kind of keeping with the end goals of the project. So again, like flexibility, you have, and I'm saying this if you need permission, you have permission to make up your performance metrics. Because if you're the team that is looking at innovation and maybe you are the one, well then you're good at doing what you're doing, and everyone else is, again, like good at, creating or building their existing business. So help them to figure out like, hey, this is how we measure success and this is the reason why. But I think the most important factor is always tag it back to why it's important to your clients, why it's important to your customers, and why it's important for your company.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for one more question and then
Quick
our
one.
quiz.
Hi, my question is for all the panelists here. So Renee talked about the matrix and I really liked the part where you talked about the ability to listen. But more often than not, we have situations in organization where we are either not listening to the right group or the innovators that are there in the organization are not speaking up, and they do not have the platform, probably sometimes, to not get that freedom to speak. So what I'm really interested to know from all our panelists here that what is the kind of ecosystem that exists in each of your organization to enable that idea flow from any part of the organization to up to the innovation center and actually adopt the idea. So yeah, that's what I'm kind of interested in.
Renee, you want to start?
Yeah, sure, if I can get somebody to innovate a way for the mic to stay up. Well, hopefully you can still hear me. I'm just going to hold it. So in the case of Logitech, we're a very flat organization, amazingly flat for the size. And I actually think this is a really key point when it comes to innovating and listening. Because of that, there's really a freedom and a comfort for literally anybody at the company to come up with an idea and send it to the CEO. And so it doesn't have to go through the hierarchy and the change. And I if I could leave, one point for the leaders in the room, flatten the communication chain. There's just no way to get there without, the best ideas honestly don't come from the top.
Mike, do you believe that?
I totally believe that.
You have an answer to the question?
No, I'd say, no, I would just echo what Renee is saying. Bureaucracy is what kills things. And as a leader, you just have to be an absolute zealot to kind of just keep everything to a minimum. And you need to be out there pressing with people because, unless you're out really understanding what people are doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it, you never really get to understand how that is. So, it just goes back to creating those forums and those mechanisms, right, where you have that ability to get those insights and have people come and you have to install in them the courage, right, that you're talking about sometimes that people don't have. And it all goes back to listening and being open.
All right, Lo, time for our quiz, okay? So by show of hands, who thinks Renee is an MBA?
Oh, come on.
And who thinks Renee is an engineer? Well, you're right, she is.
Clearly my colors
Okay, how
show.
about Mike? Who thinks Mike is an MBA? You know, of course. You can't be in finance and not be an MBA, right? Okay, he has an MBA from Kellogg. And then his rival school in the Chicago area is one of our other two panelists who has not yet been disclosed. So let's just ask the audience, who thinks Giselle is an engineer? How about an MBA? Well, she's our Chicago booth MBA. All right, so that leaves Rena, who we all know is an engineer. All right, I want to thank all our panelists. I want to take a page from Giselle and say I'm going to create my own performance metric right on the spot, and I'm going to say that each one of you have done a terrific job, A+, and thank you for listening and engaging.
Thank you.
Thank you.